Ladies and gentlemen, the late Yul Brynner.
I really wanted to make a commercial when I discovered that I was that sick and my time was so limited. I wanted to make that commercial that says simply, now that I'm gone, I tell you, don't smoke. Whatever you do, just don't smoke. If I could take back that smoking, we wouldn't be talking about any cancer. I'm convinced of that.
Now, who invented the concept of public service announcements?
Oh, well, that goes way back. They've seen public service announcements scrawled on cave walls, warning about pointed sticks.
Oh, well, wasn't there one public service announcement that said, careful, you'll put someone's eye with that stick?
That's where the saying comes from, better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. And that was repeated many times by other members in the tribe until it evolved into a public service announcement. And this announcement was often repeated whenever some disaster happened, like locusts or woolly mammoths charging through your campsite. You'd kind of just lean back, throw your hands in the air and say it's better than, what do you call it, a sharp stick with a poke in your eye.
That was the actual quote.
Language was new. You did as best as you could with the words you had. And sometimes you'd say a word that no one knew, like the word In fact, the first time was uttered from one tribe to another, which both tribes spoke different languages. The one tribe thought that meant the flat ass of a mastodon. It was an insult, but the guy who had said to the other member of the other tribe, he didn't know it was an insult. That's why there were so many wars.
Don't smoke. Whatever you do, just don't smoke.
You know quite a bit about physics and the history of physics, I understand. Well, I heard that Galileo, he was a big prankster, and he liked to drop things from buildings on top of other people. Isn't that how he got started?
Oh, yeah. That was a favorite of his because it had the right angle to drop things when there was the usual Catholic procession. Because the Catholics gave him such a hard time, so if there was ever a Catholic around, he was always quick to run to the window and dump a bucket of mule piss down on him. They gave him a hard time. He says, look, I'm looking through my telescope, I see a world up there, and they say, oh, no, you're a bad man, you're going to hell, and we're going to lock you up as soon as you leave Holland.
Mule piss, that's an element, isn't it?
If you look at nowadays at the element table, it's not there. It's MP. That was quite hotly contested by Frederick Flipper. He wanted to get it on the periodic table. He said it's an element.
Well, I heard the only reason it's not on the table is a technicality.
He got pretty despondent about that, and he invented his own periodic table, and it only had one element. Mule piss. And they'd say, well, you can't do that. There's lots of, you can't ignore all the rest. He says, yeah, well, you know what? Fuck you.
That was an element too, wasn't it? Fuck you? Wasn't that F what?
Yeah, he did. That was his second element. He said it was one of the most important elements in vocabulary.
If there were only two, it wouldn't be most important. It would be more important.
I can agree with that, but he didn't. They presented that same argument to him, and he got quite pissed off. You didn't want to get him pissed off. He started throwing mule piss at you and swearing fuck off. He lost his seat at the university pub.
Right.
I think he had a tenure at a Cambridge pub. They wouldn't give him an office, in the main body of the university, but they did give him a seat in the pub.
Whatever you do, just don't smoke.
It was an insult, but the guy who had said to the other member of the other tribe, he didn't know it was an insult. That's why there were so many wars. When Neanderthals met the Homo sapiens for the first time, they had some meetings over territory and stuff. Right. And then there was the great Neanderthal orator, Arnold the lab rat, one of the first labs that were ever set up in the ancient times. Like, how many rocks can you get Arnold the lab rat to carry before he collapses?
They'd have him carry some rocks, and then they would find that after 15 rocks, he could carry no more.
Above that, it wasn't good for your health. So then they had a public service announcement. They'd go around and they'd tell people, don't carry more than 15 rocks. It's just not worth it. It's going to blow out your kneecaps. Arnold, he decided that this is a great thing we've discovered. I should go tell our friends, the Homo sapiens. And he went over, and of course, they were kind of not really on great terms anyways, but Arnold went over and said, I want to tell you something. Lo and behold, these Homo sapiens, they thought means you've got the flat ass of a fat woman. Well, what the hell does that mean? It was kind of like a Mastodon joke. They had asses again in it, a flat ass of a fat woman. So Homo sapiens, they got pretty angry.
I mean, if someone says, hey, you got the fat ass of a flat woman.
No, it's a flat ass of a fat woman. Why is that even an insult?
Well, back then, fat asses were quite attractive.
I would think so. That means you're well fed.
Whatever you do, just don't smoke.
I think he had a tenure at a Cambridge pub. They wouldn't give him an office, in the main body of the university, but they did give him a seat in the pub. But he had a small little inheritance. Came from a long line of manure farmers.
That was discovered to be yet a third element.
Everyone used to throw manure away and said, what's the point? It's just shit. But then he said, no, it's not. You can grow things. It's fertile. You got to look where the shit is. Everything's growing where the shit is, and where you didn't throw it, it's not growing. And they'd say, what the hell do you know, you mule piss fucker? Right? They always kind of rub it in his face, but he was right.
In a literal and figurative sense. They would take some manure and rub it literally in his face.
Well, things would get out of hand sometimes. And he noticed that his beard grew thicker, and he stopped losing his hair. And then he started selling it as a hair loss supplement. Yeah, and people were buying that in the small town of Leipzig. Everyone was rubbing cow manure on their head for about 3 months, trying to get their hair growing, And also, you should take a bath in mule piss and have someone stand by the tub and tell you to fuck off. He just did this to get revenge for them initially wiping manure in his face. Leipzig was the laughing stock of the little corner of Bullgratz.
He lived on Lick My Balls Avenue, didn't he?
That was the famous goulash meatballs that were deep fried, and they were a great staple of the diet in Leipzig. And they loved it so much, everyone would always go there and have sheet balls. The wood sign that hung above the tavern. They're so good, they make you want to lick my balls.
Now, I understand that shit comes in a number of different isotopes. Like the shit from different animals. They're just different isotopes of the same thing. Is that true?
There's many variations of shit. Some of it is good for growing things. Some of it's good for calming the nerves. And some of it's good for attracting lovers. It all depends what area of Leipzig you came from, because whatever you grew up with.
It was divided into quarters. You had the Latin quarter, you had the scientific quarter, you had the shit corner, and you had my balls corner.
Everyone went to my balls corner to eat, and then there was the science quarter where they had heated debates about the isotopes of shit.
Now, I understand that the scientific media is on about how John Dalton came up with a John Dalton atomic theory. But that's a bunch of bullshit, isn't it? It wasn't really John Dalton.
Maybe, but I don't think he was the first.
Galileo had a second cousin who was...
He used to run to the top of the hill and start screaming that there's only one atom worth giving a crap about.
And what atom was that?
It was the mule piss atom. It also was good for cleaning floors, apparently. Good paint stripper.
In the early 1900s, they started to investigate the atoms in a little bit more depth. And then you had Heisenberg and his uncertainty principle. He was insecure about everything, right?
In everything. You could not get him to decide on anything. And he was in charge of decisions in Lipschitz. How he became Minister of Decisions is unknown. They'd say, Heisenberg, listen.
We have Vikings attacking with catapults of Lipschitz ship.
He'd say, yes, but are you certain? And they'd say, well, they just lobbed a great big rock through the church steeple. What do you mean? That's pretty certain. He said, yes, but was it them? We have to make sure. Heisenberg, you go and talk to them then and make certain that it's them. And he'd go over there and he'd say, was it really you who... They would lie. And then they would say, are you going to call me a liar? Or do you think I'm telling the truth? And he said, well, I don't know. I'm uncertain. That was the uncertainty principle.
He had a good friend, Niels Bohr. They would argue about the uncertainty principle.
Especially when they played chess. Bohr would always beat Heisenberg. He'd say, checkmate. And he'd say, well, maybe. And he said, it's clearly I've won. I've just taken your queen with my king. I've won. And he said, yes, but there's a degree of uncertainty in all of this. And then they get into a big battle. And then Frederick would come over and throw mule piss on both of them, because they thought that also mule piss was good for calming the nerves.
Now, I understand that mule piss and manure, they are kind of like matter, antimatter. You mix up mule piss and manure, they both disappear, and you get a tremendous release of energy. Is that true?
A big boulder fell off a cliff nearby, and it rolled down into the town, and rolled right down into the center square. And they had to remove it. They got Heisenberg in there, they got Bohr, they got Frederick Flipper. Even Galileo dropped by as a special guest thinker. And they sat there and they were wondering about it. And then they decided, it's uncertain, but I think if we put mule piss and manure together, we may get a satisfactory result. And they packed it all around this big boulder. Heisenberg was uncertain about what was going to happen, so he left. I think it was Galileo brought along some dynamite. It's just like an atomic bomb, you know. You've got the fissionable material, and you've got to pack all that TNT around it and get it going.
You need a certain amount of mule piss and manure, and it has to be in the right ratio.
They had great debates over that. It took like 3 months for them just to come to a conclusion of how much mule piss and manure they needed.
Heisenberg would never want to adjourn the meeting.
Oh, yeah, because he was always uncertain what time he should go home. His wife was always pissed off at him because he couldn't make a decision. She was always calling him a wimp. And people said, Heisenberg, why don't you leave your wife? She doesn't like you. He said, well, I'm just uncertain if she really means it.
Didn't he move for a little while? He take his vacations in a little town called Decisive?
He went there and he was considered the village idiot, really, because everybody there was able to make a decision quick and fast. They said, let's go ask Heisenberg and watch him not be able to make a decision. Hey, Heisenberg, do you want a beer? And he'd sit there and he'd debate it, and he's so uncertain. He said, well, what kind of beer is it? Where did you get it from? And how much does it cost? So they thought he was great because they had a great laugh.
Now that I'm gone, I tell you, don't smoke. Whatever you do, just don't smoke.
Well, back then, fat asses were quite attractive.
I would think so. That means you're well fed.
Right. Well, that was the big solution.
That was a big solution, and it was a big breakthrough. And then that was another public announcement, was stop wearing those fucking pants.
Well, how'd that thing get translated over 3 months? How did that change?
Well, yeah, it started off with quite a sensible idea of don't wear those fucking pants. And then it evolved into
make sure you're fucking mammoths.
That's right. That's what it was. Oh, I almost forgot. That was a rather tragic translation. You imagine someone, they say, well, he's running around with no pants on. He's got that part, but now he thinks he has to go try and fuck a mammoth because that's going to bring good luck to the tribe. That always ended in tragedy.
Yeah, well, they were never sure what position to use.
Most of the time, the mammoth just sat down. And this actually caused days of great celebration because it was quite an honorable way to go. They thought it was a sign of respect from the woolly mammoth, who their lives depended on.
What, it would just sit down?
Yeah, the woolly mammoth would just sit down, and because it felt something going on back there, and then it would sit down and then just rub its ass back and forth until it didn't feel any emotions back there anymore.
Whatever you do, just don't smoke.
Hey, Heisenberg, do you want a beer? And he'd sit there and he'd debate it, and he's so uncertain. He said, well, what kind of beer is it? Where did you get it from? And how much does it cost? So they thought he was great because they had a great laugh.
Now, Marie Curie came along after a while.
Oh, yeah, she was a popular dancer.
Oh, they loved her. She was hot.
It was the only time Heisenberg was able to make a decision. He said, she's wonderful. I actually am certain that I desire her.
That wasn't all his decision because he got an erection at one point.
Yeah, he was uncertain if it was his.
Who discovered the neutron?
Erwin Chadwick Hernia.
How do you get the nickname Hernia?
Oh, he was always trying to impress people by lifting heavy things. Even that boulder that time there, he was out there, he tried to lift it. He pulled his groin, and he got the nickname Hernia because as soon as he'd recover, just go and try and, lift anything to impress anyone.
Well, it's ironic because of all the subatomic particles, or the three big ones, the neutron is the heaviest.
The problem is, you're talking about an atom, you're talking about a neutron, and in those days, there was no way of actually seeing these things, so it was highly theoretical.
Chadwick tried to lift Heisenberg.
Once a year in Lipschitz, in order to diffuse the frustration and anger they had over their Minister of Decisions for not making decisions, the town just couldn't get anything done. Once a year, they would have throw the Heisenberg Day. People would come and they'd just throw Heisenberg, see who could throw Heisenberg the furthest. And Chadwick, even with a hernia, he was able to throw Heisenberg a full 100 yards.
They changed that ministry of decisiveness to indecisiveness.
Yeah, they just gave up. They threw in the towel and they said, well, what are we calling it the Ministry of Decisions for if there's never a decision way? We may as well just call it the Ministry of Indecisions. And then whenever we want to do something that we don't want to do, we'll bring it to Heisenberg. It worked out in the end for him, actually, but they still would have who can throw Heisenberg the furthest day.
Oh, now I understand that this whole oral history that we've got, that came from Teller, right? He was called Teller because he's the one who told all these stories.
Oh, he was the town teller. You know, there was the town yeller and the town teller. He got into big fights with the yeller because the yeller was always yelling. He would decree the news. He'd ring a bell and anything. And Teller, he would just want to speak at normal volume. Teller would always be telling Yeller to shut up. And then Heisenberg would come around and they said, well, who should be able to speak, Heisenberg? And of course, he couldn't make a decision. And then one day Yeller mysteriously disappeared. All they found was his shoe, and Teller was always suspected.
In the end, they just found out it was just a normal quantum leap.
Yeller appeared in the neighboring town in a barrel of milk. They couldn't figure out how he got there, and neither could he.
What about Hubble?
He really helped Galileo a lot.
Galileo was good for catching criminals who had got a big head start, because he could see far.
Yeah, they would put him at point on a horse. What about Archimedes? He was a famous physics guy.
He was in the bathtub, and he discovered the principle of buoyancy.
Oh, yeah, his angry neighbor came over and tried to drown him while he was in the bathtub by pushing his head under. That's when Archimedes started contemplating on the theory of buoyancy. He invented the lever, and he always had a prototype on hand.
No. He invented the lever.
That's what he clubbed neighbor trying to drown him. He clubbed him with the lever.
It destroyed the lever, so all he had left was the lever.
When you break a lever in half, you're left with a lever.
Now, where does Newton fit into all this?
He would say, watch this. He'd have a big cartload of fig Newtons down at the bottom in a barrel, and he would leap from the roof and land into the barrel and then say, look at gravity.
Yeah, but then they said, even if you didn't put those figs in the dough, the same thing would happen, right? How did he respond to that argument?
Oh, he had a tantrum. And then he said, well, then I'll prove it another way. And then he had a big barrel of applesauce. And he dove into that from the roof. And they said, well, it's the same goddamn thing, Newton. You're just jumping off into a barrel of other stuff. And he said, look, if you reverse it, sat under a tree, and he had someone go up and pour a bucket of applesauce on his head.
Right, which led to the apple.
Yeah, then the apple story came in from that. You know how things never end up accurate after they get repeated. And then they said, oh, so when you sit under something and it falls down on you, that's proof of gravity. And he said, exactly.
Well, he got drenched in applesauce. He had to leave his study of gravity.
Yeah, he couldn't afford the cleaning bills, so he decided to get into a study of something that's cleaner, like light. And ironically, he teamed up with his buddy, Friedrich Flieper. Him and Newton were together one day, and Friedrich was going on. He said, Newton, you're a smart guy. You discovered gravity. Well, I discovered mule piss. And Newton said, well, you don't discover mule piss. It's something that's there. It's already there. And he says, yeah, but I discovered it. He said, you didn't discover it. I discovered gravity. He said, no, you discovered applesauce falls on your head if you dump it from a tree. And they got into a big heated debate. And then Friedrich pushed Newton, and he fell into this big tub of mule piss that Friedrich had on his property. And as Newton was submerged, he looked up and saw separations of light into different bands of color. Friedrich Flieper, he tried to take credit for it. You didn't discover it. My mule piss discovered it. And he said, no, I discovered it because I noticed it after you pushed me in. Then he started going about his theory of light, and then Friedrich Flieper started going on that it was his light, and then Madame Curie came in and dumped radium all over the place.
Now, Max Planck fits into the story. He came along and he said that you could only move in 1-inch increments.
Well, he never got out of town. It would almost look like he's standing in one place, and someone would say, what's that guy doing just standing there? Oh, he's going to the corner store. That's Planck. He can only move 1 inch. It took him a couple of days to get anywhere.
Now, what about Rutherford? He discovered the proton. Rutherford was lifting the protons and Chadwick the neutron, and they hated each other.
You get those in a room and they all start lifting things.
Didn't they argue about which one was better?
They said, look at that table. It consists mostly of protons. I'll lift it over my head, and then you lift it over my head, and then you tell me if it's heavier than the one I lifted. And then Heisenberg said, well, which one's the heaviest? And then one guy said, well, mine's heavier. And he said, no, mine feels really heavy. And they said, well, yeah, but one must be slightly lighter. Which one's slightly lighter? And you have to take my word for it. Mine's the heaviest.
Well, that's Bell's theory about how information travels from one area to another instantaneous. That's how Bell came up with his theory.
He was in the corner of the pub watching these two idiots. So he came up with his theory. Then Heisenberg said, well, I think they're both connected. And then, of course, there was Einstein, and Einstein was a great cook. Eat equals meat times twice the carrots.
Right.
named his nephews E equals MC squared so he would always remember what he should eat to stay healthy.
You know, the thing I've never understood about this, and maybe this is where uncertainty comes in. When you say twice the carrots, twice what amount?
That was a big conundrum in his theory. And Einstein, when he realized this, he said, it's twice the carrots, but twice compared to what?
Well, that's when he came up with the cosmological constant.
I know.
Because he just made up an amount.
He did. He said, fuck this. It's twice the carrots, and I have to make up something to make this work.
Now, Pauling, he's the vitamin C guy. He's the one who created scurvy.
Just so people would take his vitamin C. And they said, well, why? We don't want any of your snake oil. And then he invented scurvy, which was stealing all the fruit in town.